Hi, I'm Lisa and I'm here to talk about loss through addiction.
Hello, welcome to the Silent Why podcast. If you're a regular, then thank you and welcome back. I'm Claire.
If you're new to us, you're very welcome. We're really glad you found us, and I'm Claire's other half, Chris.
And we're on a podcast mission to find 101 different types of loss and grief, specifically to hear from those who have been through them, to see if it's possible to find hope in every kind of loss.
In this episode, we're chatting to an inspiring woman who I met a few years ago, Lisa Newman. Plus, it's another recording we were fortunate enough to do in person.
Yeah, some people are surprised to hear that almost all of our interviews are recorded through online conversations using software a bit like Zoom. But occasionally, someone is local enough or we know them well enough to record in person. And in nearly 200 episodes, this is only the third time that we've had that privilege.
Lisa lives nearby in the beautiful and now very sought-after town of Stroud. She agreed to come and talk to us about the loss and grief that she's experienced through addiction to alcohol and drugs. This addiction first entered her life as young as 10 years old and sadly took her down into some dark places as she was growing up.
My dad, for his own protection, for a lot of that time, could not have a relationship with me. I remember spending my 40th birthday in prison and not getting a birthday card from my dad, and that breaking my heart.
Lisa talks about the impact of years of addiction, what it was that broke her open, and the challenges of rebuilding a life in recovery, while also mourning the loss of a life that you thought you were going to have.
There's lots of losses and griefs along the way. I don't have children now, I don't have grandchildren, and that's almost like this new wave of grief. Same with relationships. Never really settled down or found a healthy relationship. There's a lot of, I wouldn't say regrets, but moments when I look and I think, God, what would life have been like if the sliding doors had meant that I'd stayed on the path at that time? If I hadn't had those 10 years of a relapse.
But through it all, Lisa kept such a firm grasp on hope and the power that hope contains for positive change.
It's so underrated, honestly. People have no ideas when you have had zero hope, how the tiniest little gesture can be the thing that gives that person a bit of hope. And that is what lit up the flame in my heart that goes, I don't care what it's going to take. I'm going to fight for my life. And that's what hope can do. Hope can be the generator for motivating somebody to turn their life around.
And if you're a super fan of the podcast and you think you recognise Lisa's voice, then you're correct. You have heard it before.
Lisa was actually part of our Christmas episode when we asked previous and future guests to tell us why they find Christmas hard and what helps them get through it.
We know that you're going to love her and what she has to share, and that you're totally going to understand why she's so good at helping other people come off drugs and alcohol.
We started the chat, as we often do, by asking her to tell us a bit about an average week for her.
I am Lisa and I am a recovery coach. I have my own business agency helping people coming off drugs and alcohol. I've done various different jobs along the way. My average week is never average. It can vary vastly. It's just great to finally be here because I think we've been trying to do this for probably a year or maybe even more.
Yeah, probably at least a year.
And to be here in person.
Yeah.
Which is really nice for us to be able to, I think you're the third guest that we've had in person.
Oh, I'm honoured.
The third time, and it makes such a difference.
Well, I like being here and I like your room.
Thank you. Take us back a bit then to what it was like growing up for you, and when did addiction come into your life? When did that start?
So this is in hindsight, because what I now know of addiction is that it's more than just drugs and alcohol. And I suppose it wasn't until I started going into rehab and having psychiatrists or counsellors or therapists or group where I started realising, oh, wow. So my addiction started as a young girl in boarding school through acting out in eating disorder. I didn't even know it was an eating disorder. And at the time, it was nothing to do with food or not being happy with my body because I was too young for that. But I now realise that I acted out in those ways because I found it really difficult to navigate my emotions. As an example, my parents lived in Hong Kong. And by the way, I don't blame them for this. they lived in Hong Kong, and it was the norm to send your young kids to boarding school. And so I get on a plane, I'm in a boarding school in Somerset, and I go from an Asian diet to an English diet, and we were made to eat the food, and I had a hard time there. I mean, I was a young girl. I went there from the age of 8, coming on to 9, and I was branded naughty, if you like, so I was often punished. And I think that the levels of rage that I felt that wasn't able to be expressed, I found other ways that I could deal with those. So for me, I'd say my addiction started then, 9, 10 years old. And that's quite insane to think that, wow, that addiction can start at such a young age. But maybe, and I hear a lot of people who have other addictions, food in particular, where they remember food being their addiction from 3 or 4 years old, hiding in the larder, plundering a load of sugar. And sugar definitely became a part of another addiction. And then I started nicking things from shops. I had this fixation on stickers and stationery.
Oh, of all the things to be nicking, it sounds so clean and healthy.
Such a British thing to steal,
Yeah,
isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I loved it. And obviously it wasn't right, but I didn't know that. So drugs, when they came along, I didn't have a healthy level of fear. Things that I should have been protective over or protected of myself over. Rather than being frightened, I turned fear into excitement from a very young age, right from when I was first going on the planes to come over to England. And so when drugs first got offered and when alcohol first came into my life, I didn't think, oh, just have the one, or some of the things I didn't even ask what they were, pills or substances in Hong Kong in particular. I wouldn't even know what they were. And so didn't have that healthy protection of value for my life, which is quite sad, really, because it was quite young. But right from the early stages, I drank to almost blackout, and I'd take substances that I recognised that I was taking them differently from other people. So I might be out in town and often in some dangerous places in Hong Kong, or I'd be on something nice like a boat, but I would be the one that didn't want to stop or was hunting around for what's next, more. So it was young, really. It was young. Now, when I look at young 10, 11, 12, 13-year-olds, I think, stay young. Enjoy your youth. Go and get dirty and build dens, but yeah, I don't know if that's still really going on.
And can you summarise what length of time, I guess, if the start was that excitement rather than fear, almost the conclusion of that coming into recovery, what sort of length of time were you in a bad place?
Oh, wow. A long length of time, and I will get a bit more specific than that. So say 13 was more drink and exploring substances, pill popping mainly, and I would snort a line of something every now and then. I left school in 1989, and back then it was kind of the chemical era. It was the days of free parties and getting in a car and a convoy and looking for where the free party was and going dancing fields for a few days. So that probably kept me in some fun addiction, if you like, for a few years. But I still always wanted a profession. I still always had this drive to want to succeed in my life. So I did go to university. And so I had times where I'd go, right, I'm going to stop taking that hard stuff, because by then I'd tried crack and I'd tried some heroin. And I thought, I think that, I don't know if it was necessarily fear, but it was more, I want to succeed in life. I want a degree. I had this motivation to become somebody. And I was passionate about psychology and sociology and communication studies. And so I went and did a degree, and the same pattern. So for me, it's more about patterns that would happen of having this motivation to want to stop using certain substances. I didn't really understand the nature of addiction then. So I'd think, okay, I'll stop the hard stuff. I might just smoke a bit of weed, or back then it was a bit of solid, and I'll have the occasional drink. And then what would happen was that the first year of university was okay, and then by the last year I barely remember it and was on heroin, on crack, don't remember my finals, did my dissertation in about 72 hours, scrambled it together, and had the passion and drive and what I was really in love with at the beginning of my degree had disappeared. And so I ended up first in rehab the year after I left university, which I was 24 at the time. It was 1997. I'd already attempted to come off heroin a couple of times before that through methadone, and realised it was really hard, because what would happen is that I'd come off methadone, and one of those times I was in America, I'd come off methadone and I would feel as though I was losing my mind, and I'd think, oh my God, I am on the edge and I'm going crazy. So I didn't realise that you needed to be able to fill that hole that you feel with addiction up with something. And whether or not that's the personal development side of it, the 12 steps, something spiritual, something that's substantial enough for me to feel like, okay, I can function in the world with this pain. Because it's painful coming off the chemicals. You suddenly realise why you took drugs in the first place, because pain comes to the surface.
Do you feel when you're in the middle of all this happening, do you feel like you're in control, or do you feel trapped by the circumstances?
Yeah, interesting. So a lot of the people that have done the research and the science and studied addiction, it's quite known that denial and delusion and justification and rationalization is part of the, I don't always want to call it illness, disease, part of addiction. But I think that plays a part. I think it plays a part, and I see it in other people who are in their early stages or wanting to give up, or even family members have it, is that it's too hard to be in full flight of reality of the circumstance. So it's quite easy to have the smokes and mirrors of, oh, well, I'm not as bad as that person, or maybe I haven't tried it this way. Or for me, I would do, they call it geographicals, where I would jump on a plane and I'd go to another country and I'd think, oh, okay, this is what's going to sort me out. I'll go and do a load of yoga. I'll do some meditation, go and live in an ashram, and maybe I'll study something. And then what do you know? You take yourself with you and it still starts popping up again. So I think that when I look back, I think that there were times when I would feel as though I'm convincing myself that it isn't as bad as it is. And then you'd have those reality checks where you're sitting on the edge of your bed and feeling like you don't want to exist anymore. And you think, oh, actually, this is really bad. This is really, really bad. And maybe I need some help. And I do believe that people have to get to that breaking point, that massive reality check. And I'm sure you've heard about rock bottoms, and unfortunately, for some people, like myself, it takes multiple rock bottoms, whatever it takes to sort of break through the layers of denial, the armoured structure of trying to keep it together, the worrying about they out there and their opinions on what I should or shouldn't be doing. And it is a real shame that it's such a long journey. So that was 24, and I had a period of, I think maybe 18 months or 2 years where I was off substances, and I was going to 12-step recovery. I'd moved down to Brighton and I was living a good life, but I felt young, and so I wanted to get on with life and a career, and I didn't want to be sitting around church halls in meetings saying, my name is Lisa, I'm an addict. I thought, no, come on, I need to move on. And And so then started some relapses. And then it took another horrendous thing to happen to me to then surrender, if you like, again to trying to be totally abstinent and do everything that's suggested. And then I got about coming up to 7 years of, we call it clean. I don't know whether or not I like that word, but yeah, off everything. But I wasn't really investing in my personal development. I was investing in my spiritual growth. That mattered to me. But if I'm really honest, it mattered to me more to be getting a career and success and either working or building a business. I was an ideas person. I now realise that now that I got a diagnosis of ADHD, I thought, that's why I had ideas all the time that were really magnificent and amazing. But that's what was happening around that time.
And was that the drive that you've had for many years of education, being inspired, ideas, being driven towards career goals? What was driving that? Was that to be wealthy, to be known, to have a real purpose? What was pushing you?
I think if I'm really honest, it was for my dad to be proud of me. If I'm really honest, yeah, money mattered. It wasn't that I liked shiny, glittery things, but I liked adventure and I liked travel and I liked to have experiences, and that required money. But I realised this more recently, more than ever, was that if I'm really honest, the desire to succeed has more been about, I equate that with getting love. That, that will make up for the years of being broken and a mess and something to be shamed about. And if Dad loved me and my family thought I was enough, then I can feel like I'm enough. So I don't think it was necessarily driven by necessarily even purpose, because my ideas would have purpose, but they would be things that I would want to set up more for a charity. I would do that stuff on the side, but there was this stronger part of me that thought that until I'm a CEO of a company, which was never going to happen, then I'm not enough.
So ideas, the drive, identity, all of that still a strong motivational force in your life,
yeah,
as is the desire to live, to experience, to be excited, the high life. What then followed that? You're in Brighton at this point.
Yeah, so I was in Brighton. I had a little spell of working radio, actually, which I loved. And one day I picked up a drink. I thought, it's been 7 years. I heard somewhere that your cells regenerate after 7 years. And I thought maybe I can have a drink. That wasn't my main problem. And I picked up a drink one night casually, and then it was the catapult into 10 years of a relapse. And that relapse was pretty horrific. Lots of things happened that I never thought would happen. I ended up in prison. I ended up homeless. Not always street homeless, but never having secure housing and living in hostels, and yeah, it got pretty scary, and hospital visits and overdoses, and I think that for the majority of that time, particularly towards the end, I had given up. At the beginning, I kept having a few attempts, which is why I value my life so much today. I've gone past the 7-year mark again now, which feels great, but I value every day. It's really, really precious because my journey's been quite horrific and harrowing. And when I see other people that are in the darkness and struggling and bouncing from service to service, and it's even more strained out there in terms of mental health services and addiction services, and although they're all doing their best, and there's some incredible workers and charities and enterprises that are out there, it's tough. So I always just say to them, just don't give up on yourself. Just don't give up on yourself. Whatever happens, no matter how bad it is, just keep reaching out for help. Keep talking about it, because I think it was in that period of time that something broke me open, where I did start sharing my vulnerability. I did start begging for my life. And I remember thinking, I'll sleep in a tree if it means that it gives me a day of freedom.
Presumably, during that 10 years, being in prison, being homeless, for someone who has such a drive for the love, the, affirmation of a family, of a parent, you can't get much further away from that. That just must have been such an unhelpful driving force in the wrong direction, to just have that weight of, this is not achieving what I want or need. This is so far from that place that I want to be.
Absolutely. And I think that's the contradiction of addiction, is that quite often you're there begging and screaming for love and connection and validation and to be seen and to be heard, and yet the behavior is sometimes of somebody that doesn't care and rejecting and screaming and loud, and as if they don't want to be seen, want to be hidden and isolated. And unfortunately, it meant that my dad, for his own protection, for a lot of that time, could not have a relationship with me. I remember spending my 40th birthday in prison and not getting a birthday card from my dad, and that breaking my heart. And I'm very fortunate that I was able to build a relationship up with my dad all the way through my recovery. And he passed away in September 2020, and I was able to, along with my mum, help nurse him, be there at the end of his life and have this incredible connection. And it was during then that, from his words, he said, I never stopped loving you, but I had to step away from my own protection because it just broke my heart. And being somebody that had been very successful and capable and strong and quite powerful, he couldn't handle powerlessness. He couldn't handle the fact that there was nothing he could do. He knew that money wouldn't help if he did throw money at it. That wouldn't help. Not that he did. He kind of learnt that in the early days, not to enable. But yeah, I heard how difficult it was for him, and for my mother in very different ways. My mum would come to the front line. She'd try and rescue me from crack houses or be there in hospital. But yeah, it's a very difficult thing for family members.
We've spoken to people in the past about different griefs with aspects to them, and I think it probably is the same with addiction, where there's this level of, in some ways it's preventable and it could be seen as self-imposed, and that makes the grief so much harder if someone dies that way, or if it's something like this. Do you think that's why it's hard for parents in some way? Because I guess a lot of people don't understand it. A lot of people will say, well, just have one drink, you'll be fine. Or, well, how can you not just stop after one drink? People don't get what it's like. So I guess if you don't understand it and you can't work out why somebody's doing it, and you feel like it could be prevented but you can't prevent it, I guess it must add a lot of frustration in for people around you on the outside.
I think so. And in a way, it's really understandable why society struggles with having compassion and care and understanding for people who are struggling with addiction, because unfortunately some of the way that manifests, as well as crime and homelessness, it's also a bit of behaviours that are not really deemed very sociable and acceptable in society. So but I think that for family members, it is hard to wrap your head around. It's hard for me to wrap my head around, and I'm the one that's gone through it and done multiple courses and done quite a lot of recovery journeying. So it doesn't make sense, does it? It doesn't make sense. But when you understand that it's not just physical, that there is a mental and emotional and spiritual part of addiction, that it's not just about treating, you can't just take the drugs away and hope for the best. That's not been my experience. Okay, maybe there might be some random people out there that they do just put something down and they're tip-top happy-do, but I don't really see that. I don't.
Presumably with your dad saying that to you, on reflection, maybe you understood that. At the time, presumably you wouldn't have understood that, stepping away for his own safety and emotional well-being.
Yeah, I think even at the time I knew why. I think I knew why. It hurt. That's not to say that it didn't hurt, because I just wanted to see him and I just wanted a hug sometimes. But because I would still have communication and a relationship with my mum, she'd try and explain to me that she wasn't able to say, oh, it's because he's protecting his heart, but she'd just say, he can't cope, Lisa. He just can't cope. And so I thought, well, that's the way it is.
I think it's a really difficult area I'll be interested in your thoughts on how you educate people outside it to understand it, to have more compassion for people going through it. Because I recently listened to the audiobook, Matthew Perry reading his book, Friends, Lovers and the Big Terrible Thing, which is a very deep dive into his addictions. And I don't know what to do with it, really, because I'm cautious to recommend it. I couldn't get through it quick enough. I thought it was fascinating, but it was as graphic as it was heartbreaking. And I was thinking, well, this is a really good educational tool, but in the same way, it's terrifying for some people to listen to, because you're like, oh my word, this is what some people are going through. How do you help them? Because he would admit the same thing. There's pretty much nothing anyone on the outside could do for me. So how do you help people to understand it when a lot of what is inside it is quite, it's scary and it's terrifying, and, the rehab and the addiction and the side effects and all that. It's not easy stuff to face, is it?
No. And I think an answer to that is to read a book like that, or sit down and talk to somebody is willing to share their story, or listen to a podcast like this, or go to an open 12-step recovery meeting. And I was in a 12-step recovery meeting recently, and there was a doctor in there who had been a practicing doctor for many, many years, and so had faced a lot of people with addiction problems. And he said, oh my God, I'm absolutely blown away with just sitting here and hearing people sharing their truth, and not just sharing their stories, but sharing about how they navigate in life in their recovery journey. And I think it's one of the priceless little gems that we get if you choose that's your path in terms of recovery. But I feel really blessed in a way that I get to grow as a person as much as I do, because I think that really we need to just keep sharing the message rather than reading the newspapers that are the harrowing stories of, well, they got given a TV in prison and they still didn't turn their life around. Well, hello, it's a whole systems change thing. I think that if we stop treating a lot of criminal behaviour as just somebody behaving badly, and they started looking at rehabilitation, and they started looking at addiction more as a healthcare issue, and started treating the mental health side of things, root and branch, then we might have a different experience. But I think we're at the start of that. And I think the more people who are brave enough to speak up and that get stakeholders or in position of power in government and higher up in organisations, and are integrating that in training within organisations, then much like with mental health, it's a lot more comfortable for people to talk about the nuanced and the complexities of what it really feels like to be suicidal or depressed or have anxiety. I think that we need addiction to come out of the shadows a bit more as well. But there's reasons why there's so much shame around it, and particularly for women that might have children, or for men who are in a position of trying to keep it together financially.
What on earth is that experience like then? This podcast is about finding hope through grief and loss. So it's almost a double whammy. What on earth is it like when you get into recovery and want to celebrate that, but that then gives way to, a small or tidal wave of grief, in thinking, well, what have I lost during that 10 years? What, I want to celebrate where I am now, but where I am now is not where I wanted to be. So what's it like taking that very different sort of punch to the gut of now I have to start recognizing, yes, I'm over that, but now I've got a lot to unpick in things to grieve?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And it is one that, like everything else, you have to be real with, and you have to be able to experience the pain that actually you can still be grateful and celebratory, but equally it's still okay to be in touch with grief and be in touch with sadness and loss and maybe even anger or resentments. And so therefore part of the journey is, how do I navigate my emotions and deal with them in a healthy way? Because certainly from the generation of that wasn't taught, and thankfully there's more understanding around that. But there's a lot of emphasis on gratitude. There's a lot of emphasis on gratitude in the recovery world, but that can, if you're not careful, that can feel fake if you're not really being honest with yourself. So for me, my experience is that I'm 51 years old, and there's lots of losses and griefs along the way. I don't have children now. I don't have grandchildren. And that's almost like this new wave of grief that I'm experiencing now, is that a lot of my friends of my age that did have children, either in addiction or out of addiction, or my friends are in recovery, they have the joy of grandchildren coming around. Well, sometimes it's joy, but mostly it's joy, yeah. And Christmases are a big affair, and family photos are lots of people in a room with their brothers and sisters all having children as well. And so, yeah, there's a lot of, I wouldn't say regrets, but moments when I look and I think, God, what would life have been like if the sliding doors had meant that I'd stayed on the path at that time? If I hadn't had those 10 years of a relapse that probably robbed me of, all my 30s and a lot of my 40s, which is when you can generate or start getting some stuff together, acquiring, whether or not that's physically on the outside or internally. Same with relationships. Never really settled down or found a healthy relationship, because all of mine have been with equally lost souls. They were the people who I connected with.
And I guess they understood.
Yeah.
So it sort of makes sense.
They understood. I understood them. It's familiarity. And although those types of relationships in addiction can actually turn really quite toxic and abusive on both sides of it. And I don't mean necessarily physically, but it's a crazy world if there's two addicts in a room, because your first love and your first commitment will always be to the drugs, not to each other. That's the sad part of addiction that a lot of people can't get their head around. And I can't talk from my own personal experience, but when you hear of mothers that have to prioritize their drugs over their children, I understand that, even though I didn't have children, because nothing would have got in my way either.
You talk about when you had that 7 years and then you had that drink and that started the next 10. Help us explain a little bit about what it's like to be clean, inverted commas, whatever word you use. Because you could have the assumption now, here you are speaking very openly about it. You've seen what happened in the past, so therefore you're all sorted. You know what would, you know what would trigger another one. Where are you now, and how does that look like? Is it still literally day by day that you have to take life, or do you get past that and you think, I'm in a different place now to that 7 years?
I definitely feel in a different place, and I don't feel as though it's a ride of white knuckling and just getting through the day whatsoever. There's a hell of a lot of freedom for it. And actually the majority of the time, I don't think about it, and I don't think about my past, and I don't identify as her anymore. I get reminders. And interestingly enough, just before coming here, I went to the public toilets in Gloucester, and there was a young woman that was changing and washing in the toilet, and I could tell that she'd probably just had a hit in the toilet, and she was frenetic and sort of trying to get herself together and washing. And I can remember doing exactly what she was doing, looking in her bags. And so how it is for me now is I get little moments of reminders. Yes, sadness comes. Yes, some loss and some tender feelings come up. But I always get into a place of like, thank God that is not my life anymore. However, do I respect the power of addiction? I have to. Because you guys know that I was in hospital recently in Saudi. And so I had to have the experience of having narcotics, opiates, fentanyl as a pain relief. And oh my God, I knew that was setting off some wild little things going on inside me that got very, very excited about that. And so I had to be accountable and talk to other people in recovery so that I wasn't deluding myself that I'm invincible, because I've been there before where I felt invincible, and that's got me back in that 10-year period.
Is it helpful then to continue to work in areas and with people where you bring your baggage in a good way? You open up your baggage and share it and say, this is what I've learned, rather than thinking, no, I'm going to go and be a mountaineer and completely change my life because I don't want to face that anymore. Is there a balance?
I was just thinking that. How helpful is it to then go back into that world and actually stay close to it? Or is it better to get away?
Well, weirdly enough, it's not a guarantee that if you're involved, in fact, it's almost can be dangerous that if people are working in the field, that they stop working on their own recovery, and then it all becomes about just kind of getting their dopamine hit from helping others. I think going and being a mountaineer would be far more preferable because I'm a big one. Or, it's all dependent. It's like, what lights you up? What gives you joy? If that's what gives you joy, great. But don't stop finding things that make you happy, because I see a lot of burnout and a lot of people that go and work really hard on frontline services or in addiction recovery services, or even stuff like what I'm doing with coaching and more privatized services. But unless it's making you happy and you're breaking it up with a bit of exploration and adventures and finding what lights you up, then you're not going to... The ultimate aim is that we want a bit of happiness in life, don't we?
But then clearly, I think you've touched on this a number of times, recognizing that if there is some pain inside, that moving somewhere else, doing something else is not going to cover that. Using a coping mechanism, you have to deal with that pain before you can then be free to be happy and find joy and purpose in other things. Oh
yeah, I get what. Yeah, absolutely. You're totally right. And some people underestimate the power of that, and there are some people that might find that moving abroad and setting up a completely new life is good, but unless there's still finding freedom in their recovery.
Just a quick aside, because Claire mentioned clean. You mentioned clean, but you're not sure if you like that word. Are there words that are sort of good to help us if we come into contact with somebody who's in recovery? Are there words to avoid, you think, generally, or words to use and that are helpful?
I think that words they can have a bit of a loaded side to them. And I remember service users being a word that none of us liked when we were service users. But the whole third sector frontline support, that's what they knew us as. And it's the same with clean. A lot of people in recovery like identifying themselves as like, I'm this amount of clean. I just go in and out of my love for the word because it makes me associate, so therefore before I was dirty, and the connotations and connections of what that means for me is that it touches on shameful thoughts or memories. And so I like the word free, like how long have I been free? That's often a word, but being away from drugs doesn't always equate to freedom in the mind. Yeah, it's a difficult one. It's just about listening and having kindness and compassion. And it's never the wrong thing to say, how do you like to be referred to? I think that's quite a nice way around it, because everybody's different. And some people are choosing some very different paths to their journey of, setting themselves free from addiction.
How does it work if I were to say to you, are you an addict? Is that something that is behind you, or is that something you will always be? How does the terminology around that work?
Well, I know that I class myself when I go to meetings. I say that, but weirdly enough, I don't always like to identify as that. And I think it's one of the things which I'm certainly going through my own process around that now. The more I understand the power of words and the power of the words that we speak out into the world, the universe or whatever, and how loaded that can be. And it's an interesting question that you should ask me, because that's been my norm in recovery, is that my experience is predominantly 12-step recovery. Yes, I've gone and tried lots of other things, but I've ended up in meetings, and in meetings we say, hi, my name's Lisa and I'm an addict, or I'm an alcoholic, or whatever, fill in the blanks. And sometimes I don't like that, but it's also a part of me that connects with my fellows and my tribe. And so it is a really interesting question, because I go in and out of love with having that, because it does feel loaded, because I'd like to not be that. But I equally, as I've described with you, I've had the experience of cutting myself off from the reality of addiction and trying to delude myself that this innocent drink's going to be okay. And then how long it took me to get back to where I am now. So it is a tricky one. It's actually a really good question, because I think everybody's experience around that is different.
So are you teetotal now? Is it something that you need to do?
Yeah. I don't touch alcohol, don't touch substances. And if I have to have a painkiller that's stronger than paracetamol, I do feel as though I need to make sure that I'm being accountable about it, because it does something to me that's very different to what it would do to you. So my mum said to me when I was in hospital, she goes, oh, I tried that. It was horrible. It was absolutely horrific. And I can't remember what we were talking about. Oh, tramadol. That's it. They tried me on tramadol. And I said, well, that's the difference. It sets off a party inside of me. So I think there is some scientific evidence to show that our synapses or our wiring of our brains are slightly different from other people.
That's interesting. There's a physical response like that.
Coming back to grief and loss, you mentioned childlessness, grandchildlessness, if that's even a thing.
That should be a term. We don't use that. We should use that.
Yeah.
As well as relationships. Have they been the most painful losses to recognise? And have you identified ways for yourself that will continue in the future to be healthy ways of dealing with these things, like Christmases, seeing friends? I can't see you today because I'm out with my grandchildren, children, whatever it may be. Are there ways, things that you've put in place and got in place into the future which will help you deal with those sadnesses when they arise?
Yeah, I think that the way I don't want to use the word cope, but the way I deal with it now is to, as much as possible, without denying the uncomfortability and the pain, because when it comes up, it's good to honour that. I think that for me, I often say to myself, what can I do that other people who have children or grandchildren don't get to do? And in a way, it's one of the reasons why I set up the business that I've set up, because I can drop everything and be there for a client within a couple of days and go and stay near them or in a house, or help with a detox and get a team in place that other people wouldn't ordinarily get to do. Same with travel. Last Christmas, I thought, well, I want to go and learn to surf. And I don't want to do Christmas this year. And I made sure Mum was all right and said, are you okay with me not being around over Christmas? Not that she's a big traditional Christmas person. And so I try and do the things that other people don't get to do. And I often think that my creative ideas are something that I need to, sounds weird, give birth to or bring to life or harness. And yeah, so I think that I've had to make sense of it in a very different way. And that's not to say that the sadness isn't still there. It just doesn't stay with me and keep me in a dark room feeling sorry for myself. I touch on it and go, oh yeah, there's a whole world that I will never, ever get to experience. I'll never know what pregnancy feels like. I'll never know what childbirth feels like. When people are talking about, oh yeah, I'm trying to get them down to one nap. It's like a language that I don't understand. I've never needed to. And that can touch on, if I'm not careful, not only sadness and loss, but a feeling of less than a woman taking up space in society. And that's when it's dangerous. When I feel as though I'm not really fully a whole feminine. There's a lot of people in my circles that talk about the divine feminine and the womb and, all of this, which is, it's all great, but I'm still a woman just because I haven't had that as an experience. So I think it's important to have these platforms and have other people that have also experienced what I've experienced, whether or not with addiction or out of addiction, that for one reason or another have losses for other personal reasons. And that's where community and unity and connection is really important, and talking about it as well, and not feeling the shame of, no, you're less than a woman because you haven't been able to have children.
Dangerous, because there is that sort of assumption that if you don't have children, then you have a career or you have something else and you're going to be one of these fierce kind of career type women. And I've had to struggle with that, not having the children, but also not having the career. And then I was like, well, where does that leave me? It's like you said, you've got to really fight to say, well, there are other types of being women and doing things differently. But what I was actually going to say was I'm so glad we're having this conversation, because I think we talk a lot about grief and loss, and I don't think addiction is even in the top 10 of things that people think about when you talk about those subjects, which is such a shame, because there is so much loss attached to addiction. You have to mention a few, but also life and death. If you're in that world, you will have experienced losing people, losing friends, because of the very dangerous nature of what it is. Has that been something that you've seen and had to navigate as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember in the early days somebody saying, if you're going to stick around recovery, get yourself a black suit. And I was like, what are you talking about? And it's an unfortunate aspect of recovery is that, yes, it's beautiful to see people come to life and build their families back and careers and do all the amazing things, and then a lot of people don't make it. So there are a lot of funerals and there's a lot of losses, and some of them have been through overdoses or relapses, and unfortunately I've had a few through suicide because their recovery has been too painful for them to really make sense of the level of trauma that they've gone through, because nobody goes through addiction, particularly not addiction to the degrees that I experienced, which involved IV using and streets, and you don't go through that without huge levels of trauma. So there have been a lot of deaths. There's been a lot of people who I think of from time to time, and I don't know whether or not they're alive or dead. It's very, very sad.
Bit of a weird question, maybe. Tears and crying, when you're stuck in addiction and addictive cycles where you have things that you use to cope, do you cry less because you go to other stuff, or do you cry as much as anybody else? What sort of role do tears play in crying in the grief and the mourning of all that stuff?
God, interesting. So I'm probably the worst person to ask about that because I'm not a crier. I think that because of my boarding school stuff, part of my coping mechanism of the way I am, my relationship with crying is I don't find crying very easy, but the memories that I have of crying are of when I'm locked in a prison cell, or I don't know whether or not I'm going to go out, or I don't know if I can cope with this level of withdrawal that I'm going through. And And yes, I did cry when I found my dear friend Ricardo's body when he had taken his life, and I cried a lot then, and it felt like a cry from the pit of my stomach, like I was crying every other tear of every other person I'd lost, and it all came out. And it's a really sad reality of addiction and recovery, is that it's going to be part and parcel of that journey. I think the joys and seeing people get their lives back together outweighs that, but it is a really good question, and it is something that is worth addressing, because we do lose a lot of people, and we have spells of losing a lot of people.
Is there ever a sense of, and this is not an easy question, and it still sounds a bit callous in some ways, but because some people get so trapped in it and so lost and so destroyed by it, is there ever a sense when someone dies, there's almost like they're free sort of thing? Because I got that sense with Matthew Perry's book a bit. I heard him reading it after he died, because I was such a big Friends fan growing up. You know, I was sort of heartbroken listening to this book, that someone is suffering so badly. But then there's this sense of when you hear he's died, it's like, gosh, you know, he's free of that. He's battled with it for so long.
Yeah, I absolutely believe that. Yeah. And I don't think it is a callous question. I think that, yes, it's a shame they didn't stick around, and he's one of many sad stories. But I think that it's a sad truth that for some people, at least they're not in pain. And I know I mentioned Ricardo just now, but Ricardo was a classic example. And I know that I remember seeing his therapist at the funeral, and he said, "You have no idea the level of pain and agony he had with just being on this earth." And not everybody can totally understand that.
With all the multitudes of individuals that you've been friends with, or you've just been alongside, whether in prison, whether in recovery, whether even working now and helping, can you identify like a common theme for everybody where this starts? It's because of a lack of this or that. Everyone's journey is different, but if only everyone had this, here's a magic button, I'm going to push it now, and it will solve, you know, addiction problems for generations to come.
I think that there'd be a few things, but I think one of the main ones is just being seen, just being allowed to be them, just being allowed to take up space, just being heard, just being acknowledged. And there's lots of themes. It often is rejection or abandonment or not being given the tools of how to deal with their emotions, but it's often just lack of love and lack of, taking up space. And that's hard, isn't it? And in a way, that's what's beautiful that I see now, is that it's in the curriculum and education, and families are teaching their children to find their voice. And what was I watching the other day? I was watching the Joe Wicks documentary, and he was talking about his father, who was a heroin addict, and his mother, who had OCD and eating disorder, and he said he just wanted to be seen. And I know he didn't end up as an addict, but I think that you can tell that the way people are with their young kids now is that they give them space to be who they are. And he went to a charity in London where they were working with the mothers and fathers and family members and the children, talking very openly. It was more around mental health, but it was so healthy. And I thought, wow, hopefully that's going to have a ripple effect in the long term with society, is that there's no shame to talk about depression or the mum's bipolar or this addiction, or we'll see.
One of the questions we ask all our guests is around the question why, because the why around grief and loss is often, no one knows the answer quite often, or people have different interpretations of it. So I'd be interested to see what your relationship's been like with the question why. Why am I going through this, or why me, or any why questions dominated that journey? Have they kind of thrown their head up?
Yeah, massively. And I did for a long time try and think why. why have I ended up as an addict? You know, I've come from a privileged background and been given this education that should have armed me as a really accomplished woman in the world. And, you know, why me? And why didn't I get that the red flags were there in the early days? And why didn't I hear that person who spoke to me from their heart when I was 22 and she was trying to reach in and she was trying to explain to me and she was trying to give me a gem? Why didn't that drop until I was 34? You know, a lot of those questions, and some of them, you know, that question why can be useful in certain parts of exploring and understanding ourselves more. But to stay in the why, I don't think is helpful. I think it's better for me to go, okay, what can I do about it? How can I use this for something greater? And I think that's what I've done with the why, is rather than why me, I just go, okay, well, what can I do? How can I serve? Who can I become?
And what you're doing now, probably in my top 5 of most horrific jobs you could make me go into or sit and watch. But you're getting a lot of purpose. Do you get hope from that? Yeah, what is that giving you now you've set that up?
It's giving me some joy. Yes, it's hard and can feel a bit harrowing. What I love is the watching the light come back into somebody's eyes day by day and being there for their first laughter when they haven't laughed for 20 years and suddenly you're laughing with them. And I love hearing from them 6 months later when they say about something that they've managed to accomplish. And it's that rather than the sort of the gritty part of the helping somebody with the detox. It's more helping them with their awakening of their spirit that brings the joy into my life. And I certainly don't think I could do it one after the other. I mix it up, and I'm very much into some of my physical and the yoga and the somatics and the meditation, and being able to bring that into more accessible to people who can't afford it, and wanting to set up charities and CICs and get involved with other things which are going on. So I definitely mix up what I do as a business to other things that help me, because I think I might get burnout if I did it all the time.
You've had spells that you've referred to of just utter hopelessness. I think just tapping into Claire's question there as well, now feelings of hopefulness. What do you think of when you think of hope?
Straight away, the analogy of, and I've heard this, is hold on, pain ends, hope, which is not what I think when I think of hope. But when I think of hope, I think of expansion and possibilities and sort of openness and light that comes into spaces that have been really, really dark before. That's how I'm quite a visual person. So that's what I think of with hope. And it's so underrated. Honestly, people have no ideas when you have had zero hope, how the tiniest little gesture can be the thing that gives that person a bit of hope. I'll describe this. I think one of the turning points for me of getting clean or finding free my life this time round at the end of that 10-year period was that I ended up in hospital in Bath, and my parents had to go to New Zealand to go and see my brother, and I thought I was going to lose my leg, and I went on social media. I was in my crazy addiction, and I went on social media, and relating this to hope was that the messages that I got from people who were in my recovery from the first time round, and somebody sending me some pajamas in hospital, and somebody else sending me a tracksuit, and those tiny little gestures don't cost a lot, don't even require a lot. Some of them were really just like a paragraph of a message, private message to me. And that is what lit up the flame in my heart that goes, I don't care what it's going to take. I'm going to fight for my life. And that's what hope can do. Hope can be the generator for motivating somebody to turn their life around.
So what would you say to people who are out there who haven't experienced much about addiction and their only picture of it is a scary person in a public bathroom washing at the sink and they don't know what to do with that? What would you want them to know about people in addiction? Because we see you now. It's even hard to imagine the person you're describing because you just seem so far from that person. But if I'd have met you in prison, it would have been a very different person that I might have, maybe I was a bit fearful of you, maybe I didn't know what to do with that. But then there's this beautiful person inside. So how can we, on the outside of it, just be better, or what can we know to maybe take the fear away from it a little bit?
What I would say is that every single one of those people was once a child that was probably running around a field, potentially, if they were lucky to have friends, and somewhere along the way they got lost or weren't shown that love or weren't given the opportunities. Something has broken in their journey, because nobody at 5 years old goes, I know what I want to do. I want to end up in prison. I want to end up on the streets. I want to end up an intravenous drug user. And I want to cause as much pain and heartache as I possibly can. And I'm going to be really angry at the whole world. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants that. And in a way, when you see somebody shouting or screaming or acting in a very anti-societal way, I don't know what the right word is, but not very gracious and welcoming, is to go, they're in pain. They are acting in that way because they are in pain and they can't scream or shout or cry out the words, please help me, because their defenses are so strong and so active that is the only way to protect themselves from coping with society. And that's it. And I would say educate yourself, read some of the books. I was very surprised when my aunt and uncle died and we were clearing out the books. And I said to the cousins, it's really strange, it's got loads of books on addiction here. And they said, oh, they were interested because you were struggling in addiction. And I thought, wow, I really respected that. And it really touched my heart, because I thought, wow, they wanted to understand. And even though they might never have fully understood, they tried. I think kindness, compassion, always, should be everybody's code, really, shouldn't it? How can you soften the lens on the judgment that you are seeing that particular snapshot of that individual or society through those lenses? How can you see that through a slightly more compassionate lens?
Addiction is so much more than much of the stuff we've covered, like drink and drugs, the stuff that has the more severe side effects, let's say. Addiction is far more common with who we work with, who we socialise with, in smaller ways, whether it's use of a mobile phone, even soft drinks, caffeinated soft drinks, coffee, sex, things we do, comfort eating, and all of it, the different responses to what you were talking about earlier, rejection, abandonment, not feeling seen. So where's your head and heart with, yes, you may work with those with more severe addictions, but actually it's something that we all should be more aware of?
I think so. I really, really think so. And I think as things speed up and the more of that tech is available to us, look at what TikTok's done to social media. It's just like up to the dopamine hit degree that you can get straight away, hasn't it? And you're right, addiction, compulsion, obsession is rife, and probably we all have it to slight varying degrees, even if it's the sugar or the mobile phone or whatever. But I think one of the things that I'm always a big advocate for is finding space, finding avenues of being able to express yourself creatively in a different way, whether or not that's artistically, whether or not that's in nature. Yeah, I think find avenues and understand what's going on. I think that if people had a bit more awareness around it and support, then maybe there might be other ways. And there is now. There's a lot more scientists and biohackers and lots of platforms on social media and podcasts that are giving tips on how to be able to navigate that. But we're moving at a pace that's so fast with AI that I don't know what that's going to look like in the future. So I think the more people can stay close to nature and quietness and taking moments of pause and connecting with human beings as much as possible and finding play is, moving your body, listening to music, all that stuff. It's some of the most basic medicine that we can get. Sunlight, movement, laughter.
Final question. So we end every episode in this way. Something that you've cultivated, you've grown, something healthy that, can pass on to other people. But what's your Herman?
Mine sounds really cheesy, but it is definitely the journey from the head to the heart, the drop.
Now, that was going to be a great answer to our Herman question from Lisa, but then after the interview, her true Herman, something even more powerful, dawned on her. So she recorded that, sent it to us, and we were very happy to use that one instead.
As I was driving home after our interview, I suddenly realised what my real Herman is. And it's got to be gratitude. It's got to be gratitude. Gratitude has probably been my little saving grace through some of my darkest times. And I can remember being introduced to it years ago when I first ever listened to Wayne Dyer. And it is something which I practice today and has probably been at times when things feel so challenging and dark and chaotic, the tiniest little slither of gratitude for having a bed in a hostel or having people in my life that care about me have probably carried me through those moments. And it is something I practice today. I may not be as religious with the writing the gratitude lists at the end of every day, but it is something that I pass on to other people, whether or not they're clients, whether or not it's in a talk that I'm giving, or people that come into my life that I'm very blessed that I get to help. As I remember some very wise woman telling me, gratitude is the breakfast of champions.
Gratitude. In fact, that's the second Lost episode in a row that has shared gratitude as their Herman. The power of being thankful is something we so often underestimate, but as Lisa shares, gratitude and hope, if we choose them, can literally save lives.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, Lisa. We are really grateful for your vulnerability, your honesty and bravery in what you've shared, and also for the work that you're doing to draw alongside others.
For more about Lisa, her website and her social media, check out the links in the show notes, and for more about us, pop over to thesilentwhy.com. And if you're new to us and wondering how you'd answer what's your Herman, or even what on earth that means, then we have all the information you need over at thehermancompany.com, and again, there's a link in the show notes.
We've used this question as a way of finding out what our guests want to share with others, what they've learned through their grief and now want to pass down to help others going through something similar. The full history from Amish cake to silent why question is on the website.
And at the beginning of this year, I also launched real Hermans that you can buy and give to someone who's going through a hard time. Just take a moment to stop and think about one person right now that you know that's struggling, who you don't really know how to help. Or maybe who just needs a smile, but life's just throwing them constant frowns or tears. You might want to give them something to help, but you don't know what. Maybe you've sent flowers, but you know they're dead by now, and you don't know what else to do. Well, that's why I make Hermans. Hermans are crocheted companions, made by me in England and posted to you or the person you want to gift it to, with a little message that says that although you don't have the right words, you know that Herman will be able to keep them company and understand what they're going through. Hermans not only last a lifetime, but they also show you care and bring comfort in a very unique way. And I've had some amazing feedback from people who have drawn comfort from Herman. As one lady said, who was sent one when going through chemo and radiotherapy, who knew a blue crochet creature could become such a comfort? Thanks, Herman. And I can send Herman anywhere in the world to the person that you want to bless. And I can also add a personalised note from you, written by me, to add into his box. So to buy your Herman, visit thehermancompany.com.
Or to see Herman, his packaging and any adventure he goes on, follow his newly launched Instagram account @thehermancompany. Now then, we're finishing this episode with a quote from Wayne Dyer, who's a famous author and speaker on self-development, and who Lisa mentioned in her Herman.
Be in a state of gratitude for everything that shows up in your life. Be thankful for the storms as well as the smooth sailing. What is the lesson or gift in what you're experiencing right now? Find your joy not in what's missing in your life, but in how you can serve.